What's up, everybody? This is Tim from Arm Wrestling Secrets, and today I wanted to talk about offensive versus defensive hooks explained. Okay, so here's what we're going to talk about: offensive versus defensive hooking. Okay, so in the very near future, I'm going to be putting out some more exercises for defensive hooks and exercises for offensive hooks. Okay, but I figured the first thing to do before I got to that was actually go into depth on explaining offensive versus defensive hooking. Okay, so if you haven't seen my Arm Wrestling Secrets video series, I go into depth on that in the series. Okay, but let's go ahead and talk about it again now. Okay, so I got my stability box here. This is acting like our arm wrestling table for demonstration purposes. Okay, so if you don't know what an offensive or defensive hook is, or you have some idea, or maybe you totally know, I think this video will be instructive for you in any case, no matter what level of arm wrestler you are. Okay, so let's take a look at the hook. Okay, let's look at an offensive hook versus a defensive hook. Okay, now a hook is basically, a hook position is where your wrist is bent in arm wrestling. Okay, that's generally considered a hook position. Okay, but saying that, oh, there's just one hook or anything, there's lots of different type of hook positions and things like that. Okay, but consider it a breakdown of one of two things. Okay, offensive versus defensive hook, and this is the best way to start thinking about it and how the muscle groups play out in both those positions, because they're very different, and how you train for those positions and understanding those positions will help you avoid certain pitfalls of them and help you avoid losing in some of those situations or winning in some of those situations just by knowing the technical differences. Okay, so let's look at an offensive hook. I'll explain that. I'll show you a few angles, and then we'll talk about the defensive hook, and we'll talk about strengths and weaknesses. Okay, so I'm kind of in arm wrestling position here. Okay, I got my arm on the box. Okay, now, as I've said, arm wrestling position, your arm's going to be in the middle of your body. Now, we're just talking about offensive versus defensive hook, and I want to keep this video pretty focused. Okay, so offensive hook. Okay, your position of your hand. Now, remember this when it comes to a hook match. Okay, and I really want you to remember this. Okay, in a hook match, your offensive position, if you are in an offensive hook, which is a good thing, okay, you would turn your hand this way. So your fingers, if you're in a hook with your opponent and you hypothetically extended your fingers, if they go directly out to the side, you're in a winning position in the hook, offensive winning position, okay? With your fingers directly to the side, not kind of like this or kind of like this, totally to the side. And if you've been watching my videos, you know hooking strength is a component of several things, okay? Primarily two things: wrist flexion, which is just bending your wrist. That's all that is, okay? That's wrist flexion. You need to have strong wrist flexion because that's the movement you're doing. You're turning your wrist, but remember, ulnar flexion, the muscle on the bottom of your wrist, okay? That is a primary, extremely important, critical aspect of your offensive hook. So if you're weak in your ulnar flexion, you won't be able to maintain an offensive hook very well, because the reason is wrist flexion, ulnar flexion. That's what holds an offensive hook. If I'm in arm wrestling position and I just do a hook, that's where my arm ends up. If I do wrist flexion now, or ulnar flexion, I did the wrist flexion, now I do ulnar flexion, now I'm in an offensive hook position, okay? I can pull from there, okay? What I don't want to happen is the defensive hook position. Let me show you the offensive hook position just from the other side so you can see the inside of my arm again. Remember, so offensive hook would be, it's not just here, it's, do you see the difference there? Okay, so you need wrist flexor strength and you need ulnar flexor strength. Okay, so to turn the offensive hook, you need to turn in and flex the wrist through the low part of the hand. Okay, so for an offensive hook, those are two of the most critical strengths. Okay, obviously you need to be able to do pulling, and you need to have pronation and other things like that. But for the hook primarily, those are the two primary strengths that you're going to be needing to utilize to hit an offensive hook position, okay? Which once again is here to the side, okay? And that's going to put you in the best biomechanical position to beat your opponent, because what you're doing, if you're in an offensive position, and like I said, your offensive hook should look exactly like this on when you watch it yourself. And I would watch yourself on video, get the mirrors out when you're training, and see exactly how your position looks. Check yourself from the side, okay? Your hook should look like this, none of these other variations. If you have a good offensive hook, your fingers should be directly to the side. And that leads me right into what I wanted to say about defensive hooks. Okay, the defensive hook is exactly the opposite position. Okay, the offensive hook is here with your fingers directly to the side. A defensive hook is where your hand is turned totally up and your fingers are pointing upwards. So the person that's losing in a hook match is the person whose fingers are pointing up. Now, it doesn't need to be all the way up. A defensive hook is anything where your hand is turned upwards more than your opponent. If your opponent has their fingers down more than you, that means your hand has to be turned up. The further their hand is down, the more your hand is turned up, and you're in a defensive hook position. Okay, now before I move on, I was gonna say this. I very rarely shoot for a defensive hook in arm wrestling. If it's a very specific opponent that I think I can stop that way, and we'll talk about those tactics later, okay? But I almost never try to get a defensive hook position. It's immediately putting you at what I consider a disadvantage, okay? So if you're hooking and you're focused on just getting your hook, but you end up in a defensive position, okay? I wanted to discuss what the problems were there. It's much better to focus on trying to get an offensive hook by being faster, stronger, and being technical about your position to where you can instantly achieve a offensive position as opposed to defensive. But that doesn't mean you're not going to end up in a defensive hook, okay? That happens all the time in arm wrestling. Plenty of times I try to be faster and I still end up in a position, which is one of the primary positions in arm wrestling, a defensive hook. It's just the position where your hand is turned up, okay, and you're trying to work out of it or try to turn that into an offensive position or maybe beat your opponent some other way. But when you're in a defensive hook, all the weight is coming down on your hand, okay? And so I wanted to talk about a couple of things there. Okay, so when you're defensive hook, your palm is turned up, okay? So your fingers are no longer in an offensive position, they're turned. So anything but this, if you're in a defensive hook, that means your fingers are turned up at an angle higher than your opponent's, okay? And your opponent's more in an offensive position, okay? So what you don't want in arm wrestling, for the most part, is to have your palm turned up. If you're seeing your palm, okay? If you're seeing your palm in arm wrestling, that means there's two things that are going to happen. Your bicep is going to be at risk of being put in strain. Okay, so there's going to be strain against your bicep, and then certainly the more you see your palm, the more stress is going against your pronation. Okay, so when you're in a defensive hook position, okay, if your hand is turned completely up, now keep in mind, I can't turn any further than this. Okay, so if I'm in a defensive hook and the person's putting pressure and they're extending and putting pressure, I have no place to rotate further. I have to give up. I have to lose the match in that case, okay? So when you're in a defensive hook position, okay, now you still need the same strengths that the offensive hook person needs, okay? You still want to be able to, you want to be able to do the same hooking, but if you end up in a defensive hook, okay, you still need to have containment strength here. Okay, you still need to have wrist strength. You still need to have ulnar flexion strength, okay? But remember that when you're in a defensive hook, the best scenario is to try to maintain some kind of pronation. And I want you to really watch this carefully, okay? So a defensive hook, like I said, is anything that's worse than this, meaning like if you're turned up a little bit Worst case scenario is if you're turned completely up so that you have no room to give up this way, okay? That's the worst case scenario, because then the person just needs to keep extending and you have no more pronation to give up. So for a defensive hook, what I at least say is if you're in a defensive hook position, you have to make sure you maintain good pronation strength, even if you're in a defensive hook, which may sound funny, but it's your pronation that is being attacked. When you're in a defensive hook and the person's pulling and they're rotating your hand this way, it's actually your pronation muscle that's still being attacked. It's the primary muscle you're using in a top roll, okay? But even in a hook match, if your hand is being rotated into a defensive hook, then it's actually your pronator that's primarily weak, okay? And then the second thing too is if you're in an offensive position and you're losing that position, okay, like I said, one of two things. It's either pronation, so if you can maintain this wrist position, but you still get rolled over, then it's your pronation that's weak, okay? But more than likely, you're not going to be able to maintain this offensive position if your opponent is stronger in their ulnar flexors, because this will give up before your pronation oftentimes, depending on how strong you are, of course, right? So if you're here and your wrist is giving up before your rotation, then it could be a problem with your wrist strength too. So remember, maintaining an offensive hook is a combination of wrist flexion, back pressure, and ulnar flexion, okay? And if you're missing in some of those positions, your hand can get rolled into a defensive hook, which is a much worse scenario. It's much harder on your muscles. So remember that an offensive hook is a winning position. I always suggest you shoot for the offensive hook. Biomechanically, it puts you in a much stronger position to exert force with all of the different muscles, and you're putting yourself against in an offensive hook. And if you put someone in a defensive hook, you're putting yourself in a much stronger mechanical position than they are with their body, okay? So you're attacking with stronger muscles in an offensive hook. You're attacking with much stronger muscles than they have available in their defensive hook. And that's the thought I wanted to leave you with today. So good luck with you guys.